The sound of bare feet sliding across cold marble. Year 89 CE. You're standing in a Roman atrium, pressed against the wall with 6 other witnesses. You cannot move. You cannot speak. Your only task tonight is to watch. In the center of the room, an 18-year-old girl in a bridal veil stands motionless. In front of her, something covered in dark cloth. Behind her, a physician with a bag of tools. Beside him, an old woman whose grasp on the girl's arm says everything. There is no way out. The girl's mother cried this morning while braiding her hair. Her final words were a warning. Do not resist. Whatever they demand, do not resist. It only makes everything worse. Now the girl reaches forward, pulls back the cloth, and what stands beneath, carved from dark wood, smoothed by 1,000 brides before her, makes her face turn white. But here is what she does not know yet. The statue is only the beginning. After that comes the physician's inspection. After that comes the witnessed consummation. After that comes the written record that will mark her body as lawfully transferred property. Every Roman bride for nearly 1,000 years went through this. Every Roman mother prepared her daughter with the same quiet warning. And when Christianity took hold of Rome, they wiped it away so completely that almost no one now knows it ever existed. Stay with me, because what you are about to learn has been buried for 2,000 years. And by the end, you will understand why. This is the truth about Roman wedding nights and the ritual they tried to wipe from memory. If this story holds you, drop a like. It takes a moment and helps us bring more voices out of the silence. Now, return to that atrium, back to the girl in the veil, back to the instant before everything changed. Her name was Flavia Tirsa, 18 years old, daughter of a minor Roman official who had spent 3 years arranging this marriage. The groom was Marcus Petronius Rufus, a grain dealer, 43 years old, rich enough to matter, well-connected enough to be useful. Flavia had seen him exactly 3 times before this day. She did not love him. Love was not the purpose. In Rome, marriage was not about love. It was contract law, transfer of property, a joining of families recorded and witnessed like the sale of fields or animals, and Flavia was the property being transferred. The wedding procession that morning had been beautiful in its way. She wore the traditional flame-colored veil, her hair divided into 6 braids tied with wool ribbons, just as custom ordered. At the temple, priests killed a sheep and studied its entrails. The omens were good. The gods agreed. Her father signed the documents using the ancient formula that made the union legally binding. Flavia spoke the ritual phrase that generations of brides had spoken before her. Ubi tu Gaius, ego Gaia. Where you are Gaius, I am Gaia. The words meant she was no longer herself. Her legal self had been erased and rewritten in her husband's name. She now belonged to him. But the temple's ceremony was only the beginning, the legal beginning. What waited at the end of the torchlit procession, in the house she had never seen inside, in the room where witnesses were already gathered, that was where the real change would take place. The crowds along the street sang as the procession passed. Not prayers, not blessings. Filthy songs, blunt verses describing in crude detail what would happen to Flavia that night. Young men shouted suggestions that made her cheeks burn under the veil. Old women laughed and threw walnuts at her dress, a fertility sign that felt like mockery. Her mother walked beside her, wordless. Flavia had expected comfort, a soft word, some kind of reassurance. Instead, her mother stared ahead, jaw set, eyes hollow. That morning, while tying Flavia's braids, her mother had started sobbing. Not quiet weeping, but deep shaking cries she tried to hide with her hand. Flavia had asked what was wrong. Her mother's answer came in a faint whisper. Do not resist. Whatever they ask of you tonight, do not resist. It only makes everything worse. Flavia had not understood. She thought she knew what wedding nights involved, the basic act, the likely pain. She had not imagined what truly waited for her. The procession reached the house of Marcus Petronius Rufus as the last light faded from the sky. The doorway was dressed with wool and greenery. 2 torches burned outside, marking this as a house where a marriage would be consummated according to law. Her husband stood in the doorway waiting. Behind him, Flavia could see movement in the lamplight. Too many bodies, far too many for a private moment between bride and groom. Marcus lifted her over the threshold. Custom said it was unlucky for a bride to trip as she entered her new home. But the gesture came from something older, from a time when women were carried into their husbands' houses, whether they wanted to go or not. The door shut behind her and Flavia finally saw what was waiting inside the atrium. Count them with her. An elderly woman in formal robes, the pronuba. Her duty was to oversee everything that would happen tonight and give testimony if the marriage was ever challenged in court. A priest of unclear cult, his face half lost in lamplight. 3 female slaves holding basins of water and clean cloths. An older man with a leather bag at his feet, metal medical tools visible through the opening. And in the corner, covered by a dark cloth that hid its outline, a wooden object nearly 4 feet tall. Too many people, too many eyes, too many witnesses for what Flavia had dreamed would be private. The pronuba stepped forward and took Flavia's hands. Her grip was tight, almost restraining, as if she expected Flavia to struggle or bolt. "Welcome to your husband's house," the pronuba said. "The sacred rites must now be finished. Here is what almost nobody tells you about Roman marriage. It was not a love bond. It was not mainly about affection or partnership or growing a life together. It was a property transfer written down and witnessed, like the sale of a farm or a cargo ship. Roman law labeled marriage as conventio in manum, literally, coming into the hand. A woman passed from her father's legal power to her husband's. Before the late Republic, this shift was total. A husband held the same legal power over his wife that he held over his slaves, even the right of life and death. By the time of the Empire, when Flavia walked that torchlit street, the rules had softened a bit. Women could sometimes own property. Divorce was possible, but the core idea stayed the same. Marriage moved a woman from one man's authority to another, and like every serious property transfer in Rome, it required checking and proof. Think of how Romans handled the sale of land. Witnesses watched the exchange. The land was inspected. Rituals called down the gods' blessing. Boundaries were walked. Documents were sealed. Romans used this same thinking for marriage. The bride's main value lay in her ability to produce legitimate children. Her body was the asset being passed on. Her fertility was the resource being secured. Roman law demanded that both be verified before the deal was complete. This is not just guesswork. Roman legal writers say clearly that a marriage was not fully valid until it was consummated. The consummation had to be confirmed by witnesses. The bride's virginity had to be checked. Each demand produced rituals. Rituals that fit perfectly inside Roman legal thinking. Rituals that horrify us now exactly because that thinking is so far from how we see marriage today. The pronuba led Flavia toward the covered object in the corner. Flavia's heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her head. The pronuba's hand stayed on her arm, firm and guiding, allowing no retreat. "You must greet mutuus tutunus," the pronuba said. "You must ask for his blessing before your husband comes to you. You must offer yourself as tradition commands." Flavia reached out with shaking hands and pulled back the cloth. What stood there was carved from dark wood, polished slick by many hands and bodies over generations. It was shaped with exact anatomical detail into the form of a phallus. This was not a small charm like the ones children wore to ward off harm. This was not a garden statue. This figure was sized on purpose, proportioned carefully, made for a specific use that became horribly clear as the pronuba began to explain what Flavia must do. Mutunus Tutunus was Rome's god of fertility and sexual beginning. We know he existed because several ancient writers mention him, always quickly, always with clear discomfort. St. Augustine, writing in the 5th century as Christianity overran pagan Rome, described the practice with fierce anger. Roman brides, he said, were required to sit upon the wooden phallus of mutunus tutunus as a sacred duty before lying with their husbands. The rite was carried out in front of witnesses. Augustine was a hostile source, writing to attack pagan customs, but his account matches hints from earlier non-Christian writers. Lactantius, another Christian author, called the practice so shameful that even naming it stains the speaker. Arnobius gave the most vivid account, describing brides made to mount the god's emblem while their new husbands watched. The scholar Varro, writing long before Christianity, mentioned mutunus tutunus as a god to whom brides were presented, using careful language that suggests physical contact without spelling it out. Modern historians who mention this ritual often try to soften it. They suggest the bride merely sat briefly on the statue's lap in a symbolic act. But the words in the ancient texts do not really support this gentler version. Augustine's verb was insidere, which means to sit down on, to mount firmly. Arnobius used terms that hint at penetration. Lactantius refused to give details because they were too indecent, an extreme reaction if it were only a brief touch of a wooden object. The stated aim was divine blessing for fertility. The real effect, which Romans may or may not have admitted, was something different. Preparation. Breaking down resistance before the actual consummation, showing total submission before witnesses. Training a virgin bride to accept what would come next. Flavia stood before the wooden figure. The pronuba arranged her body, guided her movements, told her exactly what must be done. The witnesses watched. Her husband watched. The physician waited to do his next inspection, and Flavia finally understood what her mother's tears had meant, what the dirty songs had hinted at, what becoming a Roman wife truly involved. She could refuse, in theory. But refusal meant disgrace for her whole family. The contracts could be thrown out. She would return to her father's house as ruined goods. No decent man would marry her. It meant that everything she had been taught about duty, honor, and a woman's role would turn out to be a lie, and she would be marked as worthless. Flavia did not refuse. Hold that in your mind for a moment. An 18-year-old girl, surrounded by witnesses, facing something she had never pictured, and her only real options were obedience or ruin. After the ritual with the statue, the slaves washed her with basins of scented water. This cleansing had religious meaning, purifying her after contact with the god. But it also prepared her body for what followed. The physician stepped forward. This inspection was not optional. Before any marriage involving serious property, a Roman bride underwent checking by a physician or midwife. Her virginity was confirmed, her physical condition written down. The notes became part of the legal file that set her value. Roman medical writings describe the methods with dry, technical detail that leaves no doubt about what was done. Flavia had already gone through this once before the wedding, to set a baseline, to prove she was intact, to confirm she had never belonged to another man. Now, after the ritual with mutunus tutunus, the physician carried out a second examination. This one confirmed the ritual had been fully carried out, that her condition matched what the first report had shown, that she was now ready for consummation. All this took place in sight or earshot of witnesses, whose sworn words might one day be needed if anyone disputed the marriage. What stands out to modern readers in Roman accounts is not only how invasive this was, but how casual they sound. Romans did not treat these acts as trauma. They saw them as necessary steps in an important legal process. The bride's feelings about being examined, watched, and written up mattered no more than the feelings of a field being surveyed before sale. Property does not have feelings. Property is transferred according to proper forms. After the inspection, Flavia was led to the bedchamber prepared for consummation. The room was decorated as custom demanded. The marriage bed was placed so that it could be clearly seen from the doorway. The doorway would stay open all night. Oil lamps gave enough light for the pronuba to watch from her place near the entrance. Slaves who would be needed afterward waited in the hall. Marcus entered. He looked uneasy. That surprised Flavia. She had imagined he would be sure of himself, dominant. Instead, he glanced toward the pronuba with something like shame before coming to the bed. The pronuba spoke in a formal, ritual tone. The bride is prepared. The gods have blessed this union. Let the marriage be consummated in keeping with the laws of Rome and the customs of our ancestors. Let witnesses confirm the completion. Let no one deny that this woman has become a wife. What happened next lasted several hours. The pronuba watched the whole time, sometimes giving instructions, making sure the consummation was carried out in a way that met legal expectations. The door stayed open. Sounds carried into the hallway where slaves were waiting. Everything that happened in that bed was partly public, part of a verification process meant to ensure that no part of the property transfer could later be questioned. At dawn, the physician came back for a last examination. This one confirmed that consummation had taken place, that the bride was now physically altered in ways that marked her shift from virgin to wife. The examination was recorded. The pronuba gave formal testimony about what she had seen. The legal change was finished. Flavia Tursa was now a Roman wife. She would live about another 40 years. She would bear 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters. She would run her husband's household well, go to festivals, honor the gods, do all that was expected of a Roman matron, and she would never speak of her wedding night. Not to her friends. Not to her sisters. Not even to her own daughters when their marriages were arranged. Because what was there to say? It was custom. It was how things are done. It was what being a Roman wife demanded. Her silence was not strange. It was normal. Roman women did not write about their wedding nights. Roman men did not describe what they had witnessed. The rites were so built into Roman life that explaining them seemed pointless, like explaining how to breathe. Everyone knew. No one talked. This is why rebuilding these practices now means joining scattered pieces. Angry Christian sources attacking pagan rites. Dry legal notes. Awkward medical descriptions. Archaeological finds that only make sense once you know what they were built for. The silence was not a planned cover-up. It showed how deeply these acts were woven into daily life. They were the water Roman women swam in, so ever present that putting them into words felt unnecessary. For nearly 1,000 years, this was what marriage meant in Rome. Generations of women faced their wedding nights inside this structure. They saw their own experiences through this lens, then handed on what they knew to their daughters in whispers that shaped the next generation. The system kept itself alive because everyone accepted its main ideas. Property must be checked. Transfers must be witnessed. Marriage creates legal duties that require proof. Women are the channel through which families continue. The logic was self-consistent even while it was, from our view, deeply cruel. The end did not come from inner reform but from outer change. When Christianity reshaped Rome in the 4th and 5th centuries, it brought very different starting points. If women had souls equal to men, they could not simply be handled as property needing examination. If marriage was a sacred mystery, it could not include parts the church saw as obscene. If modesty and privacy were moral goods, the whole system of witnesses and physical proof insulted God himself. The change took hundreds of years. It was never fully complete in all places. But in cities and among the educated, the old ways were pushed down and erased. And that erasure included getting rid of evidence. Statues of Mutunus Tutunus were broken or hidden. Writings that described wedding night practices were removed from collections, allowed to rot, quietly forgotten. Wall paintings showing these scenes were covered in plaster. The pronuba's role shifted into something mostly symbolic, more like a matron of honor who gave advice instead of watching consummation. Within a few generations, Clear knowledge of what Roman weddings had really involved vanished from common memory, surviving only among a few scholars reading rare, damaged texts that most people never saw. The Christians who remade Rome were not only hiding a shameful past, they were building a new culture on Roman ground while denying what had once stood there. They did this so effectively that most people today have no idea what Roman marriage actually included. The comfortable story of saffron veils and tossed walnuts replaced the hard truth of checking, examination, and ritual submission. But fragments remain, pieces always remain. Augustine's fury, Lactantius's disgust, Arnobius's blunt details, Varro's careful, cautious phrases. There is enough left to rebuild what happened in those lamp-lit spaces. Enough to see what Roman brides truly went through. And enough silence wrapped around it to remind us whose experiences were judged worth writing down and whose were not. Flavia died around the year 131 CE, about 60 years old, a wife for more than 4 decades. What did she feel about her wedding night in all the years that followed? Did she recall it as horror, as resigned acceptance, as something between? Did she hope for a different fate for her daughters? Or did she believe this was simply the unchangeable way of the world? We cannot know. She left no writings. No woman of her class in Rome left such records. The silence around these rites is the silence of women whose lives were not considered important to record. Women whose thoughts about their own bodies did not matter to the men who wrote histories and legal texts. We know what was done to them. We do not know what they felt about it, but we know enough to see why later ages tried to bury this history. It shows something deeply troubling about the civilization we claim as our ancestor. Rome is supposed to be the base of Western law, the model we built on, the ancestor we praise. Admitting what Rome actually did to its women complicates that pride. It shows that culture and cruelty can live side by side, that fine legal systems can exist next to steady dehumanization, that a society can build aqueducts, argue philosophy, and create lasting art while treating half its people as objects to be inspected, signed over, and owned. The wedding night customs of Rome are gone, but the women who faced them were real. Flavia Tirsa was real. Her mother was real. Her daughters were real. For centuries, Roman women walked barefoot across cold marble toward wooden figures in dimly lit rooms. They submitted to examinations. They endured watched consummations. They came out as wives whose worth had been legally proven, and then they never spoke of it again. Their silence lasted for ages, but silence is not erasure, and being forgotten is not the same as never having been. They lived, they endured, they were muted. And now, 2,000 years later, someone is finally telling their story. If this reached you, subscribe. We dig into the parts of history that were pushed into the dark, the voices that were supposed to remain quiet forever. Because the past is not dead, it is waiting just out of sight, waiting for someone to remember.